When we talk about audio and we try to describe it, we have a lot of different words that we can use, and some of them might seem a little ambiguous, but the meanings tend to be generally understood among engineers and producers. And being able to express what you're hearing with words is an important way to identify the sonic characteristics of a recorded sound. So we're going to go through the most common words that we use as it relates to EQ and frequency. And we're going to define them in terms of what frequencies they commonly are referring to. The first term we're going to look at is fat or thick. Fat and thick can mean a lot of things when it comes to audio. Sometimes it means saturated, but usually it means that there's a healthy amount of low frequency content in a sound, generally from 20 to 200 hertz. Here's an example of a synth bass that you could classify as fat. You'll see a good amount of buildup in the low frequencies. So the opposite of fat would be thin. Fat means there's a lot of content in the low frequencies of a sound, and thin means there's not very much low end in the signal. And it usually means that there's a deficiency somewhere in that 20 to 500 hertz range. And that's going to make the signal sound thin. Take a listen to this lead synth that could be classified as sounding thin. There's hardly anything going on in the low frequencies, and it gives it a thin sound. Bright usually means that there's an excess of high end. So not necessarily less lows, just more highs. Usually anywhere from 3 kilohertz to 20 kilohertz could make a signal sound bright. Here's an acoustic guitar that we could call bright. So there's a lot of high frequencies there from the pick on these strings, and it's overall just a bright sounding guitar. And we can see that there's a lot of frequencies, a lot of things going on in the high end. Again, it doesn't mean that we don't have low frequencies in the sound, it just means that we have a lot of high frequencies. Smooth is usually the opposite of bright when you're talking about EQ and frequency. And it refers to a little bit less of those higher, harsher frequencies, usually from 1 kilohertz to 20 kilohertz. And it's just going to taper off more naturally in the high frequencies.
I don't know if you're the one or just someone, but gotta know one thing.
So that mix sounds pretty smooth because we have a little bit more natural of a tapering off in some of these high mids and high frequencies. Airy is similar to bright, but it usually refers to a bit higher on the frequency spectrum, usually somewhere above 15 kilohertz. It sounds like there's some extra air added to the signal. So we can see that we've got a lot of high frequencies going on there, and it just has that bright sound to it. Harsh means that something has too many upper or high mid-range sounds, usually between 2 and 7 kilohertz. It's not a very pleasant frequency range, which is why it usually sounds harsh to our ears. Sometimes distortion can do that, like on this vocal. Take a listen to this raw vocal with some harsh distortion added to it.
Let the truth be evident.
So we can see that these upper mids are really loud in this signal, and that's giving it that harsh sound. Nasally and honky usually refer to being too much mid-range of a sound. A little bit lower than the harsh frequencies, somewhere between 600 and 2 kilohertz usually. Take a listen to this acoustic guitar. It's a little bit nasally sounding because there's not a lot of highs, not a lot of lows, and there's a lot of those mid frequencies. So a lot of buildup here in the mids, and that's giving it that nasally sound. Muddy usually refers to having too many low mids and low frequencies in a sound. Generally, it's not a pleasant sound as it makes things sound unclear. And a lot of this usually happens between 60 and 400 hertz. Take a listen to this mix where we have an 808 that's causing the mix to sound muddy.
Lips, that's all in your body. Got that little bitch up on Molly, calling me Poppy. Do it sloppy, that she gon' give me that toppy. All in that truck, she letting me.
So we can see that we have a lot of buildup here in the lows and the low mids, and that's causing that muddy sound. Presence is usually identified in the mid frequencies from 1 to 4 kilohertz. This is where the intelligibility of speech comes from, and it's what makes things feel present and close. Take a listen to this vocal, which has a lot of presence.
I don't know if you're the one or just someone, but gotta know one thing.
So we can see here in the upper mids, we've got a healthy amount of presence, and that makes that vocal really clear and intelligible. And the last term that we'll go over is scooped or smiley face. Now, scooped or smiley face refers to a sound that has a lot of lows and a lot of highs, but not very many mids. The EQ curve usually looks like a smiley face, which is where it gets its name. Take a listen to this mix where we have a lot of low frequencies from the kick and bass, and we have a lot of high frequencies, but not very many mids. So we can see this dip in the mids, and that's where we get our smiley face or scooped sound. Now, there are countless terms that can be used to describe audio, but these are some of the most common ones that we use. And it's going to be important to know them throughout the rest of this course. It also helps you to be able to identify areas of sound with words, so that when you're using EQ, it's easier to know what part of the sound to focus on.